Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we'll be painting another miniature from the A Song of Ice and Fire miniatures game. This time it will be the Stark-Sworn Captain. So generally, we're just taking a lot of the schemes and techniques from the Sworn Swords we did before and just boosting it up and giving that extra beautiful nice touch. So we're starting off and it's just a simple metal base coat. Just like the Sworn Swords before, just make sure you thin it down. Most miniature paints, when they come out straight out of the bottle, they're not quite thin enough to give you that really crispy detail. And so make sure you don't have the paint is a bit smoother, and it gives a very nice flat surface and doesn't kind of come out as globby when you start layering it out. Now we're just going to be washing the chainmail and some of the smaller pieces of metal, and this is just to give those areas between the links some nice definition and just kind of tone down that brightness. Though you can go a little bit lighter, maybe even thin down the wash if you like, and leave these characters especially bright, so they kind of stand out a little more when compared to the other Sworn Swords. That's just a nice touch to show maybe these are minor lords or knights, and they would have maybe people taking care of their armor. So that's just one way to kind of add a little more attention to them by leaving them a little brighter, and it'll catch your eye a little more. Now for the shield, I'm doing a simple base coat in some areas, but I'm kind of targeting it. So the more exposed places, I'm leaving it brighter, as if it's easier to polish, and all the little inset areas, they don't catch as much light, and they might attract a little more dirt. So that way you can kind of leave them a bit darker. And now we're on to the larger areas, and like before, you want to take a little bit of a different approach. So you'd want to wash it down, but kind of leave those upper areas a bit brighter, and using the kind of the finger swab or the empty brush swab technique of just soaking up those upper regions of the helmet or the shoulder pad or the shield, just by you using your finger or empty brush just to clean those out and make it more of that pure base coat, just so you get that nice transition from light to dark. And here I'm kind of washing the sword a little bit just to get definition in those minor details, but later on we'll spend a bit of time trying to get a nice range of colors and a very nice transition. And so because this is a character, we can spend a little more time adding those nice details and making it extra smooth. Now, of course, we're on to the base coat of the cloak and the overcoat. So I'll be using the same color, the mix of Rakarth Flesh and the Wolf Gray. And so I'll just leave that base coat to dry after applying it. Then I'll return and use the darker tone and the lighter tone and work them together to make a nice set of highlights and shadows. So when you begin applying these, a simple way to work on your kind of technique is to consider what areas would be in light and shadow. So an easy way to kind of follow this is just let your brush with the darker color kind of just fill in those grooves, and then with the lighter color just let it catch the top of the edges, and make sure it's thinner than the base coat, the consistency of the base coat you used, and that should do a pretty good job of smoothing it on. What you can also do is kind of have areas of dampness. So you might want the bottom of the cloak, which has seen a lot more wear, have kind of like a bit of an odd layer of weathering, because of the fact it might have been sitting out somewhere, or as they're walking along the road, there's only a certain area that would catch most of the dust and the dirt and kind of darken it. So that's another thing to consider. But what I recommend is just do this several times, so you'd have that darker tone and just kind of build it up in the recesses, the lighter tone build it up near the top of the cloak, and then you'd want to do that. The front is a little harder just because there's not much in terms of direct sunlight hitting it, so you can kind of just add in those darker tones and not really have as much highlight. But that's kind of just a simple guide in terms of, all those areas on the model where to put your colors. And of course here, just adding that basic gray to the wolf sigils as we did before. Nothing really particularly special, but what you might want to do maybe is just mix in a little white and just go over in a second layer and just kind of brighten up the color a little bit if you prefer. Really just depends on your preference. You could leave it kind of the uniform color as the other soldiers if you would want to do that. And then of course, pick whatever color you'd prefer, like a nice green or a brown or whatever you think would work with the Sworn Sword Captain you're painting. And then just add that to the little undergarment that's peeking out under the shoulder pads. And then of course, like before, I'm adding just a brown wash to just give those details a little more definition, and it'll look pretty solid. And now of course we're getting onto the leather. I'm using the same as before, but you could choose to vary it up a bit, because these are maybe wealthier characters, so you could imagine them having a different set of leathers, but I just chose to keep it the same. I feel like the uniformity works pretty well with the Starks, just because they are a more cohesive brotherhood. There's not as much in the way of class. That's not really the source of pride. It's more of their sense of duty, I would imagine. So that's why I feel like the Sworn Swords and the captains wouldn't really show off. They would rather show off the scars on their bodies and the scratches on their shields. Now, of course, we're continuing to work on the metal here. After making those basic coats, I realized that it might be a good idea here to clean up certain areas. So add a brighter tone to those highlights, and then maybe a darker tone around certain areas, and just kind of pick out those places where they got a bit dirty, just to kind of neaten the model up a little bit. And we're coming back to the shield. So the general technique here, the sword, what am I saying? The general technique here is to take that base coat of metal and then put the mid-tone down, then put a darker tone down, so just mix in a little bit of black and then mix in a little bit of white. So you have 3 different shades. You could make a nice gradient if you'd prefer, or just maybe have like the darkest tone, a mid-dark, the medium basic tone, a slightly lighter tone, and then a little more of a lighter tone, just so you have a nice gradient of colors. But I believe I just went with the dark, medium, and light, and then I just blended them together. So the idea here is that I'm blocking in certain areas with light and dark. So the general technique that people like to use is opposite sides of the opposite ends of the sword have like a light and a dark. So you can see the upper part of the near the tip is dark and the lower part is lighter. And then on the near the hilt, I have the upper part being light and the lower part being dark. And then you transition it to that mid-tone in the middle, where and in the light kind of crosses over a little bit. So what you're doing essentially is creating two transitions that are opposite from dark to light and from light to dark. And then they kind of mix a teeny bit in the middle. And what you want to do is basically block out those larger areas and then keep working on it for a little while and then let it dry and see what you've come up with. If you are not happy with the transition, then you can work on it a little more, making sure that the metal is pretty thin. The colors you're using, make sure they're pretty thin, just so you when you add those adjustments, they'll be pretty minor and won't just create these jarring lines that will ruin whatever smooth transition you're trying to create. And over time, eventually, you'll be able to see something you're pretty happy with. So just take into consideration the fact it doesn't have to be perfect, but this is definitely a good place to practice because it is a pretty nice straight area, and you just need to work back and forth until you get something that looks pretty good. But remember what I said earlier, which is important. Let it dry. So create that transition and work with it a little bit. But if it's halfway through drying and you start messing with it again, it can tear up the paint and make it very uneven. So it's best just to let it dry after kind of working with it for like 30 seconds or a minute. But you could use a drying retarder, and what this will do is allow you to work with it longer. So in a single sitting, you could be able to make that nice transition and not have to worry about it drying out and then you tearing the paint up as it dries. So that's something else to consider. But here I just had a kind of a general transition just as a base tone, and then I blended in where it needed to be in the lighter area, and then the darker area wherever I saw it was a bit too rough and it needed to be smoother in terms of the transition of light to dark, not the actual texture. I have the basing and prepping videos in the playlist if you want to see that. But as you could see, I realized I forgot to do that fur part on the cloak. So I did a kind of a simple brown base tone. You could wash it if you'd like. And then I went back with the lighter tone and just kind of dabbled it on that upper area just to kind of mix up the tones a bit and create a nice natural look. And it's a pretty simple and effective way of finishing up that part of the piece. But make sure you remember to do it. And now I'm using the technical paint Blood for the Blood God. You could of course just do this using a variety of red tones. It's not too difficult just to have like a nice deep reddish color, and maybe blend it with a little bit of a lighter color, and then just kind of dab that on a bit randomly. And it should look about as good as this, but the Blood for the Blood God, I have to say, is not a bad thing to use, and it's just something I picked up, so might as well use it. You can see that a bit of the texture got on the sword, so I thought it would be a nice way of kind of showing something kind of got caught on there. And of course this is entirely optional. If you would prefer them not to have gore and blood, then you can just leave that plain, but I thought it would be kind of an interesting touch. So that is the miniature. I hope you enjoyed this video. Coming up next will be Robb Stark, and I'll be adding this to the playlist, I'll be adding him to the playlist, and I'll be adding every single miniature in the range to the playlist eventually though. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you guys for the next time.